I really want to first thank the ESS group here in Denver for the invitation, to Bill and Nancy Petty for hosting us, not just for me being hosted in their home, but for us being hosted in this incredible Egyptian theater, which is a spectacular space. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is not just my own research, which has always been based at Abydos since, as Jim mentioned, 1993. I actually started working there in 1988 as a student, working on other people's digs. But really, I'm going to talk to you more about a series of enduring archaeological mysteries. And in this year of the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon in 1922, it's particularly interesting to return to the unsolved mysteries. And many people don't realize, right, that ancient Egypt still holds enduring unsolved mysteries in great number. Often, I think, for most of us as Egyptologists, when we talk to someone from the general public, they say, well, hasn't everything been found already? And then us Egyptologists, and a lot of you who know better, just laugh. We laugh because there's so little we know, and so many enduring mysteries, and so many basic things we don't know about ancient Egypt. Just to remind you, of course, that the excavation, the exploration of ancient Egypt goes back a lot longer than just Carter and Carnarvon in 1922. A view here of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings that look like open doorways, as recorded by Richard Pocock in 1738. And of course, there were increasingly European travelers. There had always been Egyptians in Egypt who had explored and had curiosity about their own history. But European travelers start to come in the 17th century, more often in the 18th, and then with the coming of Napoleon in 1798, we see an explosion of interest in the West, in ancient Egypt. But although we see so many open doors here, if you will, there are many closed doors, many tombs we still can't account for. And that's going to be what we talk about tonight. One thing about Luxor that's so hard is it's a modern city with an East Bank and a West Bank, hotels, highways, restaurants, all of this. But in ancient times, of course, it was a very complex, different landscape. And it was a landscape that we're going to focus on today only in the West Bank. We're not going to talk about Karnak and Luxor Temple on the East Bank of the Nile, but we're going to be looking at the area circumscribed by this map. The cultivation isn't going to be our main concern today, which is the green area, still green today, still cultivated where the Nile used to flood all the way up to these line of temples that we see here along the cultivation edge. But we're going to primarily be looking at two main areas: the famous Valley of the Kings, which is entered here, and the area of Deir el-Bahri. It's a local name for the area of the temples of Hatshepsut and before her Mentuhotep, and we'll come back to talking a little bit more about that. And then a very interesting area that is less well known to casual visitors to Egypt, which is called Dra Abu Naga. These local names are basically neighborhood names and village names that have come and stuck onto different parts of Western Thebes, which is the name I'll use in this lecture for modern-day Luxor. And I'll come back to these maps again and again, so don't feel you have to memorize everything from this one map, because there's a lot to cover and talk about. This is a map of the Valley of the Kings, and it's a reminder that we have, over the course of the past couple of hundred years, discovered quite a lot of tombs, a number up to 64 tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and they're not all royal tombs, although the name Valley of the Kings would imply to you that all of the tombs are of pharaohs. There are, in fact, a variety of other kind of burials of princes, of some high officials, non-royal people, and other kinds of things that we call tombs but aren't tombs, like the recently discovered KV 63 or Kings Valley 63, which is the newest tomb that was found since 1922 and turned out not to contain any bodies, but instead had coffins filled with pillows and floral necklaces and other items which indicate that there probably is still a tomb nearby to be found, which I'm not going to be talking about tonight. Instead, the mysteries that I'm going to be talking about are the founders of the 18th dynasty, this period beginning in 1525 BC, out of a period of disunity, a century called the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos, these Canaanite rulers, ruled in the north from about 1625 to 1525. And the Canaanite rulers controlled the northern Egypt, and they pushed the Egyptian traditional pharaohs to the south, to the area of Thebes, and only with the struggles of the rulers we reckon as Dynasty 17, and then their successors in Dynasty 18 was the country rebuilt and the borders expanded to create the great empire of the New Kingdom, which we call Egypt's Golden Age often. Now, the tombs of the people who founded this dynasty, whose names reverberated down into the centuries, and in fact millennia, because they were important, like Ahmose I, whose pyramid site I work on at Abydos, these tombs have never been established with certainty, with complete unanimity, the way that Tutankhamun's discovery in 1922 could be understood with the body of the pharaoh found within it and all the material clearly indicating that that was his only and final burial place. These rulers, the first several rulers of the dynasty, all invite enormous controversy. For example, Ahmose I is the last pharaoh to have built, it seems, a pyramid. Royal pyramids went out of fashion as of his death. And we have then the introduction of hidden tombs, probably because pyramids, which had a long run in Egypt, after all, remember 1,000 years of royal pyramid building, and pyramids were exclusive to the kings, the queens, and their children up until the time of Ahmose. And at this point, for whatever reason, religious, cultural, and other reasons, they stopped building pyramids as visible markers for containing a burial for a pharaoh, and instead hide the burial place and separate the cult place from it with a separately located cult temple. This means that the thing that we know of as the Valley of the Kings is actually mysterious in one deep way. We don't know who the first king was to be buried there. We know a lot about it, but for example, Ahmose's son and successor, Amenhotep I, we know for a fact was buried at Thebes from ancient papyrus texts that I'm going to talk to you about and show you, which say very clearly that he was buried there and his tomb was intact in the time that it was investigated in ancient times by explorers who were in fact priests checking on tomb robberies. So that tomb can be found. It just hasn't been found, or at least if it's been found, not everyone agrees which of several candidates is the correct one. That's my main topic. His successor, Thutmose I, is widely understood to perhaps have been the first king to have been buried in the Valley of the Kings, maybe in King's Valley, KV 38, and then moved to a tomb called KV 20, a very long and deep tomb that I've had the pleasure of going in with Bill and Nancy Petty, our host here. And then successive King Thutmose II is pretty well established to be in KV 42. And then Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh, seems that she had moved a few times. And I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but just mention a tomb in a different valley called the Wadi Sikketak el Zaid, and then this KV 20 where she is reburied together with her father. So I'm not going to consider those in depth, but I'm just trying to show you the depth of the mystery and the depth of the complexity. Here, for example, just to review the area of the Valley of the Kings, which contains these early 18th dynasty tombs, the most famous of which many of you have visited, the tomb of Thutmose III. The tomb of Thutmose III with its Amduat texts and inscriptions all surrounding the cartouche-shaped burial chamber, very well established to be one of the first of these impressive tombs that takes things in a direction that is followed for the rest of the New Kingdom. But there is where the certainty really kind of ends. KV 20 may well be the first tomb carved in the valley, but there are some who believe that KV 38 here was the first, belonging to Thutmose I originally. And we don't know because these tombs do not have their names carved on them with inscriptions that make it very clear. We have to go on evidence found within either bodies or more usually coffins, sarcophagi, and other material, funerary figurines. And it's very, very complex stuff. So take this ride with me with some understanding that it's a complex subject. And normally we teach this kind of thing in a semester rather than a single night. This is the intact mummy, never opened in modern times since its discovery in 1881 in the royal cache, the place where all the bodies of the pharaohs were moved in the end of the New Kingdom at a point where after the end of the New Kingdom, when tomb robberies were occurring very regularly. This was tomb robbers who had knowledge of the locations of these tombs, broke into them, tore apart the wrappings, stole gold and other items that were resaleable off the bodies, burned the coffins, destroyed the bodies sometimes. So there was a cleanup operation by the priests and guards of the valley in order to venerate these ancient dead folk. Now, Amenhotep I was rewrapped probably in that period, and you see the ancient garlands, these wonderfully preserved garlands, which still adorn his body, and the mask, which is still on it. And I'll show you some recent CT scans that look inside that mummy for us for the first time just last year. This is an area that is under current research, and this is the zone of the royal cache, where many of the royal burials, bodies of the royals were buried. Not their treasures, mostly, not their coffins, mostly. That is to say, their outer coffins, not their stone sarcophagi, but just the bodies themselves, most often. This tomb, the Deir el-Bahari Royal Cache, we call DB 320. I'll refer to it again and again. It's in this zone just above Queen Hatshepsut's beautiful temple here in Deir el-Bahari. And it's in the cliffs here that the tomb robbers discovered the cache in 1881, modern tomb robbers as well as ancient tomb robbers we're going to be talking about. These modern tomb robbers, Egyptian families, were early explorers. You know, they get called tomb robbers, but they were also exploring the valley for ancient remains, and we should honor that. And in their discovery, they actually came across the most important find, really, of all, which was then removed and studied by the French archaeologist Maspero. The Valley of the Kings is just over the hill here and in the valley behind. So if you haven't been to this area, it's important to understand that. And there's a natural mountain called the Gordion, which looks like a kind of a natural pyramid, which may have been viewed by the ancient Egyptians as providing the pyramidal element that these hidden tombs would have required. Now, this is just another view, a schematic to show you the Temple of Hatshepsut, the earlier 11th dynasty Temple of King Mentuhotep alongside it, but up here, very much hidden and very, very carefully placed by the priests to avoid any re-disturbance, which worked pretty well for thousands of years until 1881, is DB 320, the royal cache. Some do believe and have suggested that this tomb was originally the place where Amenhotep I was buried, which would be a very simple answer to the whole thing, and we could stop the lecture and we could go to bed. But in fact, most people do not agree with that conjecture, and there are many, many other candidates that I'll be talking about for various reasons tonight. Now, just a little bit more about the landscape here. Generally, in ancient Egypt, when kings were buried, they are buried in series or rows. When a new cemetery is initiated. And what we're going to learn about tonight is that in general sense, in many cases, the tombs of the kings that we know about are often buried in somewhat chronological order over a space of a landscape. This landscape, Drabal Naga, and recent archaeological work since the 90s has really revealed some of the hidden tombs of the 17th dynasty rulers, these smaller local rulers who preceded the great 18th dynasty kings. And in Deir el-Bahari, there's even some thoughts that maybe some of our lost kings may have been buried in this zone, and I'll come back to that a little later on. There are several candidates for Amenhotep I's tomb, so I'm going to cut to the chase here and say there are at least 5 candidates that nobody can fully agree on. The first was discovered by Howard Carter, the finder of King Tut's tomb. Interestingly enough, before Tutankhamun, he found a tomb he called ANB, which stood for Ahmose and Tetisheri, and many of us believe that, in fact, it was the burial place of Amenhotep I's mother, the wife of Ahmose, Queen Ahmose and Tetisheri, at Drabal Naga in the cliffs, and not, of course, yet in the valley. Some think, as I said already, that Deir el-Bahari 320 was the royal cache tomb, was the burial place of the king. Others think that a tomb, I'll show you in a minute, KB 39 in the Valley of the Kings, and this was the theory particularly of an earlier archaeologist, Weigall, and then of John Rose, who excavated there, that this tomb in the Valley of the Kings was the right one. And then more recently, German archaeologist Daniel Polz excavated a huge courtyard tomb in Drabal Naga we now call K9311, that this might be the right tomb. And then finally, a Polish archaeologist from Warsaw, Andrzej Nowinski, thinks that he is going to find, and has not yet located, but it has eternal hope that he will find the tomb in the cliffs above the temple of Hatshepsut. So that's a lot of options, and we have a lot to cover. But I think it's pretty interesting. And the first one we'll look at is right below that natural pyramid I mentioned to you, in the cliffs at a kind of a liminal zone of the valley, is this tomb we call KV39. By the way, the numbers were not given in any kind of chronological order except by chronological order of discovery of the tomb. So don't worry about the numbers. Some think that this tomb, which is about 120 cubits or 63 meters below some workmen's huts of the workers who built and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, may indicate the actual location, that this is the X marks the spot of Amenhotep I's tomb that we know about from some texts, and I'll come back to it. But this identification, again, is not based on any inscriptional material. It's not based on anything within the tomb that tells us that this tomb belonged to this pharaoh, and it's only based on how well or not this tomb fits criteria that are described in ancient texts. I'll just quickly show you the inside of the tomb. A little unusual that it has two main axes and two main burial chambers here and here. And so it's an early style of tomb. We could tell, if we didn't know anything about this, we would know it was an early 18th dynasty Valley of the Kings type tomb. And here we can see one of the other candidates that I'm going to come back to later, K9312, which is a candidate described by Daniel Poltz, and I'll come back around that. But just to show you, this is outside the valley with the roadway, modern roadway, to the valley this way. Now, what I want to show this image for is, many people don't know this object, but it's quite an interesting thing. This was found in 1916 by Howard Carter, working with Lord Carnarvon long before the tomb was discovered. Outside the tomb of Horemheb was this little faience cup that named Tutankhamun, a very obscure pharaoh at that point. And it was one of the indicators that showed to Carter that he could perhaps be on the path to Tutankhamun. The reason I'm showing you this is, quite interestingly, if we put the discoveries that Carter and others made around the search for Amenhotep I, we put those alongside the discoveries made leading up to the 1922 discovery of KV62, the tomb of Tutankhamun, we can see some interesting parallels. So in 1881, they find the mummies of Ahmose, Amenhotep I, and many, many other 17th and 18th and even 19th dynasty rulers in tomb DB320, I've already told you about. And that was opening a whole page of history. They could look at the mummies, they could look at the bodies, they could make all sorts of conjectures. 1906, that faience came, I said 1960, it's 1906, wasn't found by Carter, pardon me, it was Theodore Davis from Newport, Rhode Island, found near Horemheb's tomb. 1909, he finds in a tomb gold foil with the names of Tutankhamun and his successor Ai. But on the Amenhotep I side, Weigall was the one who suggested KV39 might be the tomb of Amenhotep I. Then in 1914, Carter finds a tomb he says is the tomb of Amenhotep I, A and B. 1915, Earl of Carnarvon takes over the Valley of the Kings concession from Theodore Davis, who's famously declared that the valley is empty, there's no more to be found. In 1922, Carter examines tomb K9311 and doesn't associate with Amenhotep I, but interestingly enough, that's the year that Tutankhamun's tomb was found. My point of this slide is really just to say that there was a search for lost tombs by Carter and other Egyptologists, including a very active search for Amenhotep I. And Carter really thought he'd tied that one up and was then moving on to Tutankhamun. So it is still a mystery that has to be examined again. And in this regard, it's interesting that last year, Zahi Hawass and his colleague Sahar Salim did the first CT scans of the intact mummy of Amenhotep I. And what do we find out from it? We find out about the age and dental health of the mummy without cutting open the wrappings. But we also find about gold and other items on the body, including this beaded girdle, probably of gold beads, and a faience, maybe amulet in this shell form. So these days, we don't have to cut open mummies to investigate them very detailed ways, and this is a great thing. But once again, that doesn't give us the location of the tomb. Why do we care about Amenhotep I? Why is he important? Why was he enduringly important in ancient Egypt? Well, although I don't think he was the initiator of the Valley of the Kings, and most people do not, they think that that honor is reserved for Thutmose I, two kings later. He was venerated by the workers who worked in the Valley of the Kings as their patron god. And they didn't just venerate him as a god for a random reason. There has to have been a reason, such as him establishing the workmen's village, or more likely, just organizing the workmen in some important way that he would then forever after, for hundreds of years, and in fact, his cult went on for 1,000 years, be regarded as an extremely important king who was connected to the building and decoration of royal tombs. And here on the left, we see, with dark skin not indicating her ethnicity, it seems, but probably for rebirth and regeneration concepts, Ahmose and Nefertari, his mother. Bear in mind, often people talk about them together as if they're husband and wife. They are not. It's mother and son. And an interesting part of the story is that Ahmose built with his wife, Ahmose and Nefertari, the sites at Abydos that I have worked on and discovered. But it seems that Ahmose never really built anything significant at Thebes at all. I don't think there is a tomb to be found there. Others do think there's a tomb of Ahmose, maybe. But what happens at Thebes is all about mom and her son, who's become the pharaoh. It's not about Ahmose. That is all happening at Abydos. And I think, for reasons I'll end the lecture with, that that's what really did happen. Now, I'm going to quote from you Nick Reeves and Richard Wilkinson's Complete Valley of the Kings. The burials of Ahmose's successor, Amenhotep I, or Amenophis I, same thing, and that king's mother, Queen Ahmose Nefertari, have not yet been firmly identified, although there are contending claims for tombs, both in the Valley of the Kings and at Drabal Naga. The special veneration accorded this pair by the subsequent builders of the royal tomb might suggest that these monarchs were either the first members of the dynasty to be buried there, or the first to establish officially the location as a dynastic royal necropolis. So this is repeating what I said, but just a very concise statement of what we know. Now, another thing I want to tell you about, I told you that pyramids stop for pharaohs with Ahmose, and then they do hidden tombs. So we have the abandonment of pyramids from the transition from 17th to 18th dynasty, but there are many other tomb changes. They have the initiation of the Valley of the Kings as a new necropolis, which is guarded and secret and a very special place. They have new types of funerary equipment. They have larger and more elaborate gilded or even coffins covered in gold, like Tutankhamun's second coffin, which is wood with thick gold layering. They have royal shabtis, or funerary figurines, that are meant to do the work of the dead in the next life. There are shrouds with texts of the Book of the Dead, which did not exist before. There are texts and scenes on the tomb walls in these early New Kingdom or early 18th dynasty tombs that feature the Amduat, books of that which is in the netherworld. So a lot of things are changing. Pottery changes, all sorts of things. Here's one of these royal shrouds of Thutmose III, in this case, that is inscribed with an early version of the Book of the Dead. And this one's in Boston now. And what's interesting is that here's just a little bit of a review talking about these shrouds. Owners include Queen Tetisheri, who was the grandmother of Ahmose, two princesses called Ahmose. It was a very popular name back then, kind of like John or Jane, except it was sort of gender neutral. There could be men and women Ahmose. So one of them was the daughter of 17th dynasty King II Henry Tao, two princes Ahmose, and two other individuals whose name were composed with Ahmose. So everybody was Ahmose back then. It's likely that the reformulation, says Peter Dorman, of funerary practices was not isolated. It was accompanied by the introduction of new pottery repertoire and the appearance of rishi coffins in a feathered pattern. So this is, I think, important for everyone to remember that what I'm talking about is not just some lost tomb and some random thing, but actually a reconfiguring in Egyptian religious, artistic, cultural sense of many things. Here, from a 20th dynasty tomb at the workman's village, is the achievement of the workman in Herkau, and he's shown offering his incense to Amenhotep I, the most important of these figures, but also to Ahmose, Ahotep, Ahmose's mother, and on and on. Ahmose and Nefertari, shown black again down here, and on, pharaohs and princes of earlier times. So this veneration of these pharaohs and these kind of images serve as a kind of a king list. But where we get the most important information, and I shouldn't have waited this long maybe to say it, is from a specific text in the British Museum now, the Abbott Papyrus. Now, this is the coolest discovery in some ways ever in Egyptology, because it's a legal text that describes that some tomb robbers were apprehended, they were beaten, they confessed their crimes, and they told what they did in looting the tombs of the kings. And what's great about it is they both have verbal confessions about what they did, how they went into a tomb and tore apart the mummy and burned the coffins and things like that. But more importantly, what the priests decide to do to clean up the mess of all these looted tombs is do an itinerary. And the itinerary is a careful list with some X marks the spot type descriptions of the landscape that say where these tombs are. And they do it in an order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 here that I'm going to talk to you about. And every single one of these words, if you look here, you see the pyramid of so-and-so, the pyramid, see the pyramid hieroglyph, and then the cartouches, these name rings that name the king in question, the pyramid of, the pyramid of, the pyramid of, except for one person, Amenhotep I, and I'll show you this again in a slide you can read in English, a different word, the tomb of Amenhotep I. And that tomb word, yes, is meaning it's not a pyramid. So this is important for us. Now, I'll put this into English for you in one way. This is the list. Now, the list was not chronological. That is to say, it's a list in order of the tombs as they were visited. So first they went to the tomb of Amenhotep I, and they say it was intact. Then they went to 11th dynasty tomb. Then they went to a 17th dynasty tomb. And then these tombs no one's ever found, but presumably in order, because this is a landscape list, right, across the landscape. And I'll show you these on the landscape so you can follow it. And they end with the famous temple that we do know exactly where it is of Mentuhotep II next to Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari. So what does this list give us? It gives us knowns and unknowns. The first one, we don't know the location of. But in the 19th century, and I'll show you more about this, this tomb, Intef II, Dynasty 11 of the Middle Kingdom, was located. We know it. Then also in 2000, Daniel Poltz, the great German archaeologist, found the 17th dynasty tomb of Intef V. We know where that is. So what we can do now is we can take a map. We can say, yes, we know that. No, we don't. No, we don't. Yes, no, no, no. And that's what I'm going to do for you now. Now, the first thing that's really hard is all this is in hieroglyphs, this written language from 3,500 years ago in this case. And it's hard to interpret some of it. But it begins with a description that says here, the description of the mer, which is the Egyptian word for pyramids, the yis, or tomb, hidden tombs, and mahat type tombs, and that's a whole word we can't talk about tonight, but 3 typologies of tomb types, mer, yis, and mahat tombs that were inspected on this day by the officials. And then they mention all the pyramid tombs, and then at the end, or at the first one they mention, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. The first one they mention is the eternal horizon of King Jeser-Ka-Ra, son of Ra, Amenhotep I, which measures 100 cubits in depth. From its stela, question mark, we don't know, called Pa'aka, north of the house of Amenhotep of the garden. Now, that sounds great, right? This is almost like one of these things from a treasure hunt, like Forrest Fenn, right? Who had that treasure that people were searching for in a chest filled with gold, and all you have to do is follow the poem and then find the chest. This is very similar, except, you know, we're dealing with an ancient language, and nobody can agree on what these words mean. So even the same scholar, Poltz, he wrote this article in English. This is his translation. Down below, here's my translation from another German publication, The Horizon of Eternity of Jeser-Ka-Ra, which measures 120 cubits in height from its ahai, called the high or long path, to the north of the house of Amenhotep the garden. Now, the same guy can't translate it the same way twice because he has different ideas over time about it. And I'm not making fun of that. It's that complicated. But this word ahai is one of our key words. He believes that it's a long path up to the tomb he has discovered, which doesn't have the name of Amenhotep I on it, outside of the Valley of the Kings, and he thinks he's found the tomb. And what every scholar does is they take this bit of text with 120 cubits, which is 63 meters, 180 feet, and they take that measurement and they try to make it fit what they have found. Or they go the other way and they look at some obvious location high up, because the word high is important here. This word, where did I have it here? Pa'akai. Kai means high, up in ancient Egyptian. So the one thing we know is that high, or maybe it means long. And if you find a long or high thing and then you draw a line to it. Do you have your spot? Unfortunately, it's very complicated. And here Polt says it very succinctly. The description of the location of the tomb is far more detailed than those of the following tombs. And for the ancient Egyptian reader, remember, it was unambiguous. They knew what they were talking about. We just don't know. The passage is extremely ambiguous for us. Besides the question of the adverbial phrase north of the house is relating to stela, pa'aka, whatever that means, or by the eternal horizon, the passage contains at least 3, if not 4 unknown terms. Mjet, which is either meaning depth or height, and that does matter, right? If something's 120 cubits deep, then that could be down a shaft or down a hill. If it means height, well, that's something else. One word that is translated with stela, ahai, it's a hapaxagomenon, it's a single occurrence, we don't know what it means. The same is true for pa'acha, which by its determinative, the word, that the sign that shows it seems to indicate a term connected with the verb to be high or height. And lastly, the place called Temple of Amenhotep the Garden is not positively identified with a known building. In other words, we have an equation of 4 unknown quantities, which you have just undone basic grade school math to know that that is unworkable. So let's look at the landscape, take a deep breath, and look at what we do know. The first thing we know is that these priests started off with Amenhotep the first tomb, wherever it was, and then they went to the tombs at Tarif, here in the north part of the West Bank. And these tombs are well known. They are large style 11th dynasty tombs, and we know the priest number 2 was over here. Then they go over here and they look at the tombs of the kings of the 17th dynasty who were not yet building hidden tombs. They were building pyramid tombs. Every single one of these is described as a pyramid, no question. And they're in the area we now call Drabal Naga. And amazingly, nobody found any of these. There was a very important study, which I've mentioned here, by Herbert Winlock from the Metropolitan Museum, 1924. Winlock wrote this article called Tombs of the Kings of the 17th Dynasty at Thebes. It's a brilliant article. If you read one Egyptological thing, it should be that, because he was a genius and he tried to figure out where all these tombs were located. And you would think that someone would then have gone in 1925 and said, well, we'll take the itinerary and let's dig and find these kings' tombs. Nobody did until 2000. Daniel Poltz did. And in fact, if you read in the footnotes of the thing, it even says, for the tomb of King Nubkeperi-Intef, it should be near the tomb of Shuroy, who's a later non-royal person. Well, Poltz works next to the tomb of Shuroy, and there's the pyramid of the missing king of the 17th dynasty. So now we know a few things. 1, they had brick pyramids. 2, they weren't very big. 3, they were all in a row. And if Poltz keeps digging, and others perhaps, then we will find all these tombs again described in this itinerary, which is good news. Because the closer we get to filling in our Mad Libs here, our variables, then the less question we have about the missing ones. The next area is Drabal Naga. After Drabal Naga here, which is outer cliffs, and I'll show you pictures of that, is the great bay, open area of Deir el-Bahri, where Hatshepsut placed her temple. Amenhotep I actually did build a little temple there, and we know he built a little temple just here, which I'll show you in another plan. So this Temple of Amenhotep of the Garden could be one of many places, and that is also complicated. And then what you've visited, if you've gone, and know well, if you've gone to Luxor, ancient Thebes, are the temples that stand now of the pharaohs, such as Ramses the Great, the Ramesseum, Medinet Habu, Ramses III, Amenhotep III's massive temple with the statues, the Colossi of Memnon. These are the rows in chronological order, in a general sense, of temples that go with the valley hidden tombs of the kings. So Winlock tried to figure out where these priests walked. He tried to walk in their footsteps. And here, just without all that nonsense, are just the 3 areas at Tarif, Drabal Naga, Deir el-Bahri, just to, again, show you more maps and orient you. Now, the tombs of the 11th dynasty are really cool. Number 2 on the itinerary from the Abbot Papyrus, the tomb of King Entef II, which in modern Arabic is called Sef el-Kisisiya, not important. It's a courtyard tomb with pillars and then burials inside of it. Now, how did we know that it was the right tomb that's mentioned in the ancient texts? Well, in the Abbot Papyrus, they say that The tomb, and this, by the way, Abbott Papyrus was written in year 16, Ramses 19, Dynasty 20. So the end of the New Kingdom, a time of some political weakness, which is why tombs are being robbed. 1110 BC. It says in hieroglyphs, the pyramid tomb of King Intef-Aa, which lies north of the house of Amenhotep of the court, a different temple of Amenhotep, whose pyramid is destroyed, but whose stela is still preserved, on which the king is shown with his dog, called Bakkai, at his feet. It was seen on this day and recorded. Well, in one of the coolest bits of archaeological discovery ever, in 1860, Auguste Mariette found at El Tarif a stela, and the stela is of King Intef II, and it has 3 dogs at the feet of the king, and one of them is called Bakkai. So that is the dog mentioned by the ancient priests in the hieroglyphic text, seen by them and recorded almost as a kind of as an X marks the spot thing. So number 2 is not only known down to a general area, it's known down to a few centimeters. We know exactly where that is. And in 1884, it went to Cairo. 1970s, it was rediscovered by Peter Arnold, who published it. And here you see a beautiful reconstruction by Poltz of what that wonderful stela with those pet beasts with their collars and names. And by the way, the Egyptians did always name the dogs, and we have those in many versions. Well, they can have names like Blackie, and they can have names like Bakkai, and sometimes they have names that don't mean anything to us, but they're cute names too. Now, dog collars. Yeah, they had dog collars because they were pets. So going on here now, number 10 on the itinerary, I'm trying to bracket our known elements, is at the far other end. Next to Hatshepsut's temple, the pyramid, as they call it in the text, of Mentuhotep II at Jebel Bahri. Now, the interesting thing about this structure, which is not open to tourists nowadays, if you look at it from Hatshepsut's temple, you see a flat top thing. And that is because there's a great debate about the original reconstruction, how to understand what this thing looked like in antiquity. But the fact that these priests in 1110 BC said it was a pyramid means a lot to me. And the fact that the German archaeologist Dieter Arnold, whom I respect deeply, says that there was never a pyramid there, I find problematic because, I tend to believe the ancient Egyptians when they say something's a pyramid. In my experience and in my own research, I've discovered that if you dig something and it says in hieroglyphs it's a pyramid and it has a hieroglyph that's shaped like that, a pyramid, it's going to be a pyramid. And this is why I think that this reconstruction is probably the correct one rather than alternate ones. So that's an important little point too. Pyramids existed at Thebes in great profusion. Now, interestingly, Mentuhotep II was connected with the cult of Amenhotep I. And why? Because they lived many, many years apart. One lived toward 2000 BC and the other one 1525. So that is 500 years apart. And yet they're shown alongside each other. And what I believe is that, in fact, this is more than anything due to not necessarily the location of the tomb of Amenhotep I in this area, but there certainly were temples underneath Hatshepsut's temple of Amenhotep I. And we know that from a few bricks that have been found years ago. Now, this is where I've tried to take a Google map itinerary and show you the order in which these individuals may have gone based on Winlock's 1924 thing and using what I've already described to you. So the first tomb found by Carter, the tomb called A and B, is often thought to be Amenhotep I. And it kind of fits because it's high up. They could have well started here, as Winlock pointed out, and then gone over here to number 2, and then come over here to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, before they went to Mentuhotep II's temple over here at number 10, off the map. That itinerary is a good walking itinerary, and Winlock, with a lot of charm, describes the priests huffing and puffing up the hill and down the hill. And it's really charming to think about these human beings doing this thing of inspecting these tombs. And by the way, the tombs spread, as I said, for a period of some 600 years, which is pretty interesting to consider, 500 to 600 years. Now, we had known that Nubkepere Intef's funerary material was known since the 1830s. And here's a drawing of it from then. And Daniel Poltz was searching for it. And as I said to you, it was not that hard to take Winlock's indications that it was next to the tomb of Shuroi and rediscover it as he shows here in his reconstruction drawing, a narrow, high, very small brick pyramid. These are not impressive. These are not pyramids on the Old Kingdom scale or the Middle Kingdom scale. They're titchy little things that look more like later non-royal pyramids. These were not rich kings who had massive empires. These were kings who were stuck south of Abydos, down to Aswan, and they only controlled the south. They did not control Egypt. They didn't have access to the routes in the Red Sea. They didn't have access to the Mediterranean Sea. So they weren't part of worldwide trade. And in that way, they built small. And so in a way, this was an interesting discovery. Poltz then went on from that discovery to look at some other tombs, several tombs in particular, that were interesting, that were large courtyard tombs carved into the cliffs high up. Now, in ancient Egypt, height matters because, at least on a cliffside, poor people are buried down in the watery or wet kind of low grounds. And this is true of real estate generally, right? You want to be, I've seen it in Colorado here visiting, the fancy houses up on the hills, the junky ones down in the valley maybe, or it depends. For flooding, that's often a reason, and flooding was an issue in Egypt too. So the rich people, the top people, are at the top element, the second stratum, second and lower, and on and on. These tombs are massive, they're imposing, they were noticed by earlier archaeologists, but because there were no hieroglyphs and there were no gold items and nothing particularly impressive found in them, they were just recorded, mentioned, and nothing more was done. So Poltz went back to them in the 90s and started asking questions and saying, what could these be? Before I go on to that, I'll just show you one of the neat things that Poltz found in the 17th dynasty pyramid. That little brick one I showed you, and here it is in plan, is he found the actual capstone, the pyramidion, we call it, which has the name of the pharaoh on it. And that is a very satisfying little piece of info to add to it, because you get the exact angle, right? So we're not making up what the angle was. We know the angle because the tip had to match the angle of ascent of the whole pyramid. Now, interestingly, pyramids were built at Thebes in the 17th dynasty up to probably the time of Ahmose, the predecessor of Ahmose. But pyramids were also built, royal pyramids, at Abydos. And I identified Tetisheri, the grandmother of Ahmose's pyramid at Abydos. Again, one of these cases where they called it a pyramid. I did the excavation, we proved it's a pyramid, and I found her capstone, her pyramidion, which is pretty cool. Ahmose built a pyramid there. Perhaps his wife, Ahmose Nefertari, did. Even a prince might have. And yet we have no tomb of Ahmose ever mentioned at Thebes. And I want you to stop and take in this point, so I'm going to repeat it. There is no tomb of Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty, the father of Amenhotep I, and the successor of the 17th dynasty kings, ever mentioned in the tomb itinerary. Why? They say they went to Amenhotep I's tomb, it was intact. They say they went to some other tombs, they were looted, they were robbed. They just don't mention Ahmose. And by the way, there's no mention of a temple or no indication of a temple of Ahmose at Thebes. And there's no priests of his cult. There's nothing. There's not even a scrap until something some French scholars found. I'll show you a little bit later on of Ahmose at Thebes, which might be interesting to think about. And instead, there's a figure they call King Ahmose Sapair. Now, we know that he was never king. He was a prince. He probably died young. He was Ahmose's son. And he had a pyramid. They call it a pyramid. But it's interesting they call him king by mistake, because these guys, as I said, don't usually make big mistakes. Why do they call him king if he wasn't a king? I do find that very interesting. And there's some things to talk about there. Well, Winlock, the same gentleman who was working on this whole series of tombs, found a pyramid, a brick pyramid, a small one, at the very entrance to Deir el-Bahari. Now, what we're doing is we're turning the corner here from Drab el-Naga, from what I've just talked about, numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Going around the corner, and we're right here at a small pyramid in a courtyard. This is the causeway of Mentuhotep II, his temple, or number 10. And if you kept going this way, you'd hit Hatshepsut's temple. So it's a turning point physically for burial location. And if we look at, just to remind us what Hatshepsut's temple looked like, that's the area in general. Now, what's really neat is that Winlock found the pyramid. He never published it in any regard. So the only publication we have is from Daniel Poltz in recent years, who went to the Metropolitan Museum, found these beautiful plans, big plans, photographed them, published them just in the past few years. So we can look at 1913 drawings and see, oh, there's a burial underneath, there's a brick pyramid on top, very steep brick pyramid, like the 17th dynasty kings. Who did this belong to? Now, there's a neat little fact about this, which is that the red walls here are of that early 18th dynasty time and of that tomb. blue walls are Ptolemaic, which means 332 BC to 30 BC walls. This is 1500, 1550 BC about. This is 300 BC. What are they doing? In the Greek times, they're still renovating, honoring this person who was buried here, and they're rebuilding it. So one thing we think is that this fits in the location of where that king or prince Ahmose was buried. And he's a very interesting figure. And one thing we know about him is he had a veneration from the time of his life in the 18th dynasty through the Greek times. So this fits. And I think this is correct. I think we know now that this is that tomb. Now, I mentioned that Carter had found a tomb that before he found Tut, he decided, okay, I've found Amenhotep I. I'm done with that king, moving on. And the tomb was very interesting. It is in Drabalnaga, up on the hill, pretty high, and goes down into a series of chambers. But it contains stone vessels. And the stone vessels are of Ahmose and Nefertari, who's the mother of Amenhotep I. They have some names of Amenhotep I on them. They're just stone vessels, though. They're things that go in a tomb. They're not coffins and bodies. But they also have inscriptions of the Hyksos king Apophis, who was the ruler of their enemy in the north and of his daughter. So there's something weird about this tomb. It's very interesting. And what I can tell you about this that I know from my research is that this is very late. This is at the end of the reign of Ahmose, at least, that this is being inscribed, because she's called a mother of a king and a great royal wife. And she's also called the sovereign, which is a thing that usually only the king is called. So she's a very important person, maybe like Nefertiti was or Hatshepsut was. She becomes extremely important in her own right. So here is the tomb, A&B, Carter's, and this is his plan from 1916 publication. His tomb here, this is a temple that was found of Ahmose and Nefertari and Amenhotep I. And what's interesting, it's a joint mother-son temple. We don't have any other examples of that particularly. And it's oriented, interestingly, north-south, which is unusual. Here is the tomb that Poltz now thinks is directly oriented with that temple and is the probable burial of Amenhotep I. So that fits. The question is, does this fit the description of the priest in the tomb robbery papyri? So we can ask ourselves these questions. Now, a complicating factor is, as I mentioned, the tomb of Amenhotep I is mentioned in relation to a temple called the House of Amenhotep of the Garden. So when they use these terms like the house, that really means temple. It's a common word they use for temple, so house in quotes. House of Amenhotep of the Garden was something that meant something to them. And it's possible it is the same building as something we call the Men-Iset, another ancient Egyptian name, a temple of Ahmose and Nefertari and Amenhotep I, this thing here. If it is that tomb that they're saying is 120 cubits, then Poltz may well be correct. And I think that everything hangs on the correct identification of the temple. If it is this temple, then that is probably the tomb, but there's nothing within the tomb to indicate that in any way clearly. And as you can see, there are a number of other things, terms used, the Temple of Amenhotep, sometimes they refer to the Temple of Jeser-Kara, which is another name of the king. And some of the also, I didn't even list it here, they sometimes say the House of Amenhotep of the Courtyards, another tomb, another temple relating to another tomb. So in 1896, a temple was discovered, joint temple of mother and son, Ahmose and Nefertari, Amenhotep I, in Thebes. It's oriented north to south, unlike most funerary temples. And again, an excavation happened in the 20s, but was never published until Daniel Poltz did recently. A better plan of the temple that we now can see really the building. We could even do a reconstruction of it and so on, but that hasn't happened yet. It sits out right in front of the German dig house. If you've been to West Bank of Luxor, you'll know where that is. Now, when we look at this itinerary, I mentioned already that one thing that jumps out about it is it's not in chronological order. The first king mentioned is Amenhotep I, perhaps because of his great importance to the tomb priests and the king priests and workers, but maybe also because of its location in the landscape. And that is still important to be a consideration. And then we go to all the way to 10. But here we see them in chronological order, and we see that it sort of matches. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 here are in the right relative order. 9 is in the right relative order, but 10 is not. It's earlier. It's this guy up here, and Amenhotep I is later. It's this one up here. So just a reminder of some of the complexities. Now, Poltz, as I mentioned, the temple would be down here in the valley. This is a view from up on his excavation area of K9311, what he thinks is the tomb of Amenhotep I. And the main thing about this tomb is not what we can say about its inscriptions, carvings, and the people associated with it in the 18th dynasty, but with a much later time, the Ramesside era, some 250 years later. And that is where we have a lot of inscriptions naming a high priest of Amun, so a guy who was very high up in the priesthood called Ramses Nacht. And there are a lot of pillars showing Hathor, the cow goddess, and here just another view of the excavated area. Now, what Poltz has, and it's, I have to say, a very convoluted argument, is he thinks that this is the tomb of Amenhotep I because it's big, it's near his temple, and because later people wanted to be associated with it. And the later people were very important high priests. Okay, does that really sound convincing? Is it enough information? And I say no, because it may be that he's right, but the problem is we just don't have the smoking gun yet. And he would disagree with that and say it's good circumstantial evidence. I would say it's weak circumstantial evidence. But the one thing that remains is we have a honking large, enormous set of 2 courts, burial chambers, and these are tremendously large early 18th dynasty or late 17th dynasty tombs, and they have to fit into our itinerary, and they have to be of somebody important, and they look royal in every regard. So without any decorations, carvings, and inscriptions to tell us who they belong to, you could see the coffin shaft here, coffin-shaped recess in the floor here, and a small chamber in the back. We can only say that this is a very good possibility. Now, I mentioned to you a Polish archaeologist, Nowinski. Nowinski was working in Deir el-Bahri, but he's working on the coffins of the priests of the 21st dynasty, a different project. But he started to ask himself, well, if all of the priests of the 21st dynasty, the third intermediate period, wanted to be buried near Hatshepsut's temple, then probably some of the main high priests of that period were buried there too. So he starts digging around and looking in the cliffs, but then he gets obsessed with the idea he's going to find the tomb of Ahmose I, like many other archaeologists, and he's still up there chipping away. Now, I'm going to say, and I'm not going to be politic here, but one thing that Nowinski's doing is he is potentially threatening the temple below, because he is demolishing boulder after boulder after boulder, just breaking them down with hammers into little bits that can be put into these long chutes. If you've been at Deir el-Bahri, you've seen his chutes, and sometimes you're there when dust is arriving because all this stuff is being shuttled down. It's the strangest search in a way, and I'm just being frank with you because I think it's important to be. It's like someone hunting for a needle in a haystack. There's no good indication that this is the place for the burial of Amenhotep I. We have better possibilities. We have no specific reason to place it here, and he's chipping away at the hillside. And Dr. Hawass, many of us know about, the former minister of antiquities, has actually been very active in saying that this is a project that shouldn't go on. And even looking at the excavation reports, you know, he talks about the niche and the gate and the crevice, and I look at it and I just see a bunch of rocks, and I don't get what he's talking about. He's not finding, like Poltz did, an enormous courtyard and that at least we could talk about, and there are no discoveries to connect it to Amenhotep I at all. So maybe he'll surprise us, and maybe he'll find the tomb sitting there intact with carvings on the walls, and it'll be solved, and then I will eat my words. But it's a very complicated project. Now, I'm going to take some time to just mention my own work because it's part of the puzzle, and I think it's a neat part, because I told you that we'll never find Ahmose, in my opinion, at Thebes, because he wasn't mentioned in these itineraries, because he's not on the ground there. What we do have on the ground that argues for him being buried at Thebes is, of course, his body was found in 1881. It was found in a coffin renovated for him because all the gold had been stripped off of it. I've talked about this in RC conferences before. It had solid gold sheeting like Tut's sarcophagus, and that was ripped off. You can even see the nail holes where they took it off, and it was repainted. So this is not the original appearance in any regard. It was a beautiful feathered gold inner coffin and outer coffin with gold-covered wood. And this is probably his original inner coffin reused for a prince. And this is the outer coffin. You can see they're almost identical if we put them alongside one another. And here you can see how different in scale these are, so that inner, second, and outer coffins of 3 different individuals, really you can see when we stack them up in the Cairo Museum in a way that they're no longer displayed because they're now in a new museum, moved to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. What we can appreciate here is that there are different parts of this equipment. Just to go on and show you, here's the inside with Ahmose's mummy, which was opened up and investigated, and that's his coffin as it was found in 1881. I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to get rid of that and go on to show you A and B, because it's out of place, and I apologize for that. This is the tomb I mentioned that Carter felt was Amenhotep I, not very large, not impressive. I think it's more likely Ahmose's mother at Thebes in A and B. And then the last thing I want to say about Thebes with regard to Ahmose is in 2019, actually, I think even in the past year, 2021, a French archaeologist, Frédéric Collin from Strasbourg, was digging in the area of the causeway of Ahmose III at Deir el-Bahri. And when he was digging there, he found bricks, and the bricks bear a very interesting version of the name of King Ahmose, which I first discovered and wrote about at Abydos. And that version is a name of Ahmose that is called Hekatawi, the ruler of two lands. Ahmose, once he's defeated the Hyksos, in my opinion, becomes called the ruler of two lands because he's reunited the kingdom, the country, and he has expanded the borders, and he's then taking on a new identity. And we know that he was the one who had this name because the same name is shown alongside as Ahmose Nebkhtira here, his famous name, and then as Hekatawi, a ruler of the two lands. Now, on bricks at Thebes, in this area I showed you in the previous slide, 9 bricks so far have been found that say Hekatawi, which is the post-reunification of Egypt version of Ahmose. Collin believes he's about to find the tomb of Ahmose at Thebes, based on 9 stamped bricks. Whereas we have a pyramid complex of extraordinary complexity at Abydos. So I leave it to you to decide whether you think 9 stamped bricks versus a royal complex at Abydos is more convincing. But it's a very interesting new indication that most people have not heard of. I'm going to zip past this and just show you a discovery that I first read about today online. A Spanish mission working on the cliff walls around the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri have found what they believe to be a face carved into the rock on a colossal scale, 20 meters, 60 feet up. And you can see here a digital reconstruction. And I'm going to tell you, this is not what you'd see if you stood there. And I am highly skeptical in some ways until I've seen the full results about whether this is just Photoshop or Rama. But you see a round head here. It looks like ears. And I've had just today back and forth with the archaeologist, Jose Ramon Perez Asino. And Jose Ramon tells me, well, in fact, we have good evidence. And below it, there's cult place. And the cult place has various elements that we can see they were worshiping at. So what is it? It's probably a face of Hathor emerging from the mountain, the cow goddess, or it might be another goddess, Meret Seger, she who's beloved of silence, who protected the valley behind. So was she a protective goddess? But what I want to point out to you, isn't it cool that one word we can't figure out what it means is the high thing, right? Ta'akai, the high place. Well, if you had a 20-foot high head like the Sphinx or the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan sitting up in the cliffs, right? Wouldn't you think that'd be a pretty good marker to say 120 cubits down from it is the tomb of Amenhotep I? And DB 320 is in this direct area. So I'm just throwing out there that there are topographical features that are being actually discovered, which may in fact be the things mentioned in ancient times, and we are maybe on the brink of finding out some of those topographical spaces. Now, I've told you that we don't know where many pyramids are, but we know that Ahmose built for his wife, for himself, and for his grandmother at Abydos. His funerary figurines in the British Museum bought in Luxor, so maybe also found at Luxor, but it could have been in the cache and it could have been reburied. A gold ewer was found at Tanis in the royal tombs there, taken from Ahmose's burial when the body was removed in year 8 of Susenes. And what these kings did was when they saw things they liked from the royal burials, they took them and put them in their own burials at Tanis. And then we have a massive series of monuments at Abydos, which have been the subject of my research since '93, my PhD dissertation, and ongoing work. So a terraced temple built by Ahmose, which every brick bears his name, no question it was built by him. A rock-cut tomb of Valley of the Kings type with an 18-pillared hall. very much in the style of the early 18th dynasty royal tombs at Abydos out here. And this is just a place alongside a royal tomb at Abydos, which is even larger. Carvings from the pyramid temple at the base of Ahmose's massive pyramid, which is built on Middle and Old Kingdom scale, 100 meters, 100 cubits, which is 52.5 meters, 150 feet. Carvings that, when we study them and match them with adjoining fragments, like this one in the Metropolitan Museum, we can reconstruct the decorative program and see the pharaoh joined by the gods. Battle scenes, which were very important when we found them in 93 and continue to be, because they're the only known scenes of warfare against the Hyksos, including Nubian archers firing up, ships traveling to probably war, horses and chariots, which are the earliest detailed ones in Egyptian art ever found, still, with their bridling. And you can see a pair of stallions here, another pair of stallions in a different group here, and a reconstruction we did to just show that they're going up to fight the Hyksos at Avaris, firing arrows, cutting down their grain, traveling by ship, coming back, thanking the gods. This is the only place where that is shown. It's the only place ever. And Thebes, they never mention the tomb of Ahmose. They don't mention a pyramid. They don't mention anything. We have 9 bricks. I feel that Abydos was where he intended to be buried, and that may not have happened because of his successor, Amenhotep I, who may have changed his mind and said, no, Dad's going to be buried in Thebes somewhere. That is possible. Or he could have been buried at Abydos and then moved. That was not rare. Ahmose also built at Abydos in order to, in my view, sanctify Abydos as a new holy ground. He builds a pyramid, as I have identified it, and it was not identified at the first excavation in 1904 as a pyramid, but we can see from the inscription, which mentions it as a pyramid, and from the form of it on the ground and the pyramidion capstone we found, we proved that this is the pyramid of Queen Tetisheri, Ahmose's grandmother. And why that's important is he's basically building a mini brick pyramid like the 17th dynasty kings had at Thebes at Abydos to sanctify his own pyramid. He's creating an ancestral ground. There's the capstone of Tetisheri's pyramid. Here's Ahmose and his wife, Ahmose and Nefertari, early on. And we are shown with a prince here who's called the eldest son, but his name is not Amenhotep. He's not Amenhotep I. He's young Prince Ahmose, maybe Ahmose Sapair, who's then venerated at Thebes. He dies young. Ahmose's pyramid consists not only of what we have reinvestigated somewhat, a maybe unfinished pyramid, but also the pyramid temple with the carvings and tomb, the battle scenes, temple of Ahmose and Nefertari alongside of it, maybe a temple, a pyramid for the queen, although that's still conjectural, and an enormous economic area for baking bread and other things alongside of it. And this is just our ongoing research. But what I want to show you here is just the scale of Ahmose's buildings at Abydos versus the little pyramids that we can identify at Thebes. So these are tiny, not very impressive brick structures Ahmose builds in stone. And in fact, he reopens the northern quarries at Tura, which were the casing stone material used for the Great Pyramid, for the Giza pyramids, Dashur, Abu Sir, on. And he even used foreign animals and foreign labor to drag the stones from Tura to his temples throughout Egypt. And he tells us this. He says he did it in year 22 of his reign, which is after he defeated the Hyksos. And he did it alongside Ahmose and Nefertari, the mother of a king. Now, this is why I find this particularly interesting, because, in fact, we know that she had a chief architect called Neferperet who carried out the excavation of the stone that carried out the building at Abydos, because we find his name on these buildings that we excavated. And in Syria, before the war there, archaeologists found a royal tomb there containing stone vessels naming gift of Queen Ahmose and Nefertari from the chief treasurer Neferperet, the same architect, I think, who built, quarried the stone and built at Abydos. So we have some real evidence that Abydos was the place, not Thebes. So I'm just going to conclude this and say, I don't know where Amenhotep I is buried. I'm not coming down firmly on that for you today. I wanted to show you the problem and expose it to you. What I do think is we can say something about where Ahmose was buried for Abydos. We have the massive stone-clad pyramid of Ahmose, as well as temples for himself and his queen, the memorial pyramid complex for his grandmother, Tetisheri, a rock-cut tomb. So actually, I have two possibilities for where he could have been buried at Abydos, in his pyramid or in the tomb. Terrace temple with some funerary objects, boats and paddles and other things that are very much like things found in Tut's tomb. Priests were associated at Abydos for 300 years, as well as an oracle. Pharaoh Ahmose was worshipped as a god at Abydos for 300 years, whereas his son, Amenhotep I, who's certainly buried at Thebes, was worshipped as a god at Thebes. That is very telling. Also, royal burials occurred at Abydos in dynasties 1, the first dynasty, the second dynasty, the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty, and now with Joe Wegner's spectacular discovery of royal tombs of the Abydos dynasty, King Sennacherib, who we never had heard of before, we can say that there were pharaohs even, or local kings buried even in the second intermediate period. It's also, and I find this very important, the only known location of scenes of Ahmose's battles against the Hyksos. And he did that at the foot of his pyramid. Now, why do people not agree with me that Ahmose was buried in Abydos? Well, number one, there's the body and the coffin and the funerary figurine seemingly found at Thebes. And Thebes was the place where his ancestors were buried, most of them. And the precedent of royal burial at Abydos is not what people expect. But I think the evidence for Thebes is very weak. So what is the pro for Ahmose buried at Thebes? Mummy was found reburied there. Wasn't in its original tomb. It was reburied in a cache. Nobody questions that. Funerary figurine, bought on the art market at Luxor. Well, you know, bought on the art market in Luxor means that it could come from anywhere, because the art market was in Luxor. You didn't buy things anywhere else generally in the 19th century. The con, why not Thebes? No mention of the tomb in the ancient lists. No mention in the funerary papyri, the tomb robbery papyri. No tomb can be associated with Ahmose in the Valley of the Kings, which seems to begin later. There is no funerary temple of Ahmose known from ancient texts, and not a single block from a temple known from excavations. No cartouche with his name, nothing except 9 bricks found last year. No priests associated with this cult, and no tradition of the cult of Ahmose at Thebes, where he was never worshipped as a god, and no oracle. So I feel that increasingly people are coming around to understanding Abydos in a different way. And one of the reasons I give lectures like this that look at Thebes is to also point out what's missing. Not just what's missing from Luxor, but also what's missing there, because we'll never find it. So we will find the tomb of Amenhotep I. That will happen. Somebody will. They'll make a decisive discovery and or figure it out in a way that everyone agrees with. But I don't think anyone will ever find Ahmose at Luxor, at ancient Thebes. I think that we already know that Abydos was his place. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you.